Could I have your attention, please? I hope you're enjoying your lunch. Please continue to do so. Dessert and coffee is forthcoming. Dessert's on the table, of course, already, but please continue to enjoy your lunch as we begin the program. I'm Ken Medlock. I'm the director of the Center for Energy Studies here at the Baker Institute. Welcome. We're happy to see such a big crowd and here to sort of hear a discussion and engage in a discussion about an issue that's incredibly dynamic. I think in the last 2 weeks alone, there's been so much change that it makes some people's heads spin a little bit. But we certainly are privileged to be able to co-host this event with Chatham House out of London. Fantastic group of scholars, some of whom you'll hear from, addressing a variety of issues ranging from energy to many other things. Of course, today's focus is on energy and geopolitics in the Middle East in particular and the implications for oil markets. We're also very privileged today to be joined by Chris Tomlinson. He's a columnist with the Houston Chronicle, long history covering energy. Lots of penmanship to his name, if you will, books, articles. You've probably seen his picture in the Houston Chronicle multiple times, but he's very well known in the space, and he's going to actually moderate the conversation today amongst our panelists. So if I could call you all up, and I will yield the floor.
Well, thank you, Ken. It's actually an honor to be here today. I come to many Baker Institute events. As you can tell, I'm the one who doesn't have a PhD at the end of my name. This is the place where people like me come to speak to the experts, the people who study it in and out every day. And I'm joined, and it's my pleasure to moderate a panel with some really brilliant minds on what's going on in geopolitics. For those of you who haven't been keeping track, the Middle East has become a Game of Thrones in real life, with all sorts of palace intrigue, national leaders being held against their will or maybe not, and a lot of competition among countries that are extremely important to us, primarily because that's where our energy comes from. First up, we're going to hear from Jim Crane. He is the Wallace S. Wilson Fellow for Energy Studies at Rice. His research addresses the geopolitical aspects of energy and with a focus on the Middle East and OPEC states. And before he went off and went to the Ivory Tower, he and I worked together in Iraq during the invasion in 2003. He was my colleague at the Associated Press for a long time, and we walked the bombed-out streets of Baghdad many a time together. Next up, we're going to hear from Paul Stevens. He is a distinguished fellow at Chatham House, and he's an economist and a specialist on the Middle East at Cambridge and the School of Oriental and African Studies. He also taught at the American University of Beirut. And batting cleanup, which I know Christian doesn't understand because he just told me he doesn't understand baseball, is Christian Coates Ulrichsen. And he is a Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East. And he's working across the disciplines of political science, international relations, and international political economy. So everyone's going to make about a 5-minute opening remarks. I'll ask a few questions. Hopefully, we'll start a fight, and then we'll give everyone a chance to make their comments and questions toward the end. So, Jim, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I once saw a special on the BBC about all the baseball references that had infiltrated into to the English parlance. So it was kind of funny, and a lot of folks, they were asking if they knew what they meant, and people really didn't. So a lot of baseball references. So he may know
exactly
batting cleanup. So today. Three of us will make a brief opening statements, and then we'll get into a Q&A. I'm going to try and set the scene just a little bit. The oil exporting countries of the Middle East are undergoing a series of pressures I'm just going to walk through a few of those here. First one is lower oil prices since 2014. Okay, they're not rock bottom now, but they've come down quite a bit from their highs of $100 plus, and this has, of course, put pressure on countries whose economies are dominated by oil revenues, but it's also provided a window of opportunity for these countries to reform some wasteful practices, some subsidies on energy, or maybe recalibrate the social welfare benefits that have gotten a bit out of hand. So it's kind of provided some political cover to do some reforms in these countries. The second one is unrest. Okay, so there's been it's a region that's not unfamiliar with political unrest, but as of late, it's been higher than usual. It's been at a pretty high level. That we'll hear about that. Most recently, this rise of ISIS, Islamic State, has had the effect of pushing citizens closer to their leaders, having citizens kind of rally around their kings, their ruling sheikhs. And that's also given governments an opportunity, a window of opportunity to kind of tweak the social contract and do some reforms. Another one is the rise of shale oil from the U.S., and that's had the effect of this elastic source of supply that can kind of come online when prices allow and go away when they don't. This has served to restrict OPEC's freedom of action, and it's kind of boxed them in a way so they can emphasize market share and try to take market share from their competitors, or they can emphasize price and try and boost price, but they can't really do those two things simultaneously any longer, or at least attempt to do those two things simultaneously. Another one is climate change and climate risk, climate action by governments. Probably a longer-term risk to these economies that are dependent on exports of fossil fuels. Now, I would argue that I think people have differing opinions on how that risk is going to play out. I think it's one thing you can say is that it's going to be difficult to predict, because predicting government policy reactions is pretty tough, and this involves a lot of countries taking various actions. And the last one is this rise of a younger generation of leaders who've been pursuing more assertive and independent foreign policies that we're not really used to from that region, especially in Saudi Arabia, really pushing the envelope in its foreign policy in a new and very unfamiliar way for those of us that watch the Saudis. And also domestic policy, some real changes, much sharper domestic policy that we're seeing. So that's all I'm going to say. I'll hand it over to
Paul?
Okay, thanks very much. Good afternoon to everybody. Pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about the role of Saudi Arabia in the international oil market. And the whole story is extremely complex. If you're not confused, you don't know what's going on, to do the old adage. And I always like the quote from Daniel Boone, the frontiersman, who was once asked, did he ever get lost in the wilderness? He said, well, I never rightly got lost, but I was bewildered once for 3 days. So prepare to be bewildered. The role of Saudi Arabia in the oil market has been to try and manage supply in order to balance the market. This is the so-called swing role. So if the market is oversupplied, they cut back. If it's undersupplied, they actually increase it. Now, last year, they managed to negotiate in December 2016 an agreement within OPEC and non-OPEC to try and manage supply. In other words, get somebody else to come along and help them do it, so they didn't have to do it on their own. That December deal was extended to March next year, and on the 29th of November, OPEC meets again to decide whether or not to extend that agreement. The chances seem to be likely that they will extend it, but the problem is that the market still remains oversupplied, and that seems to be unlikely to change. Having said that, however, the market now has geopolitical premium on price coming back into the equation. After 2014, the geopolitical dimension of oil price tended to disappear, largely because there was so much of the stuff around. But the instability in the Middle East and the activities of Saudi Arabia over the last couple of weeks have tended to put that political premium back on. And it's unlikely that political premium is going to disappear. The Middle East as a region is incredibly unstable. As a historian of the region, you have to go back to 1918, the end of the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, when the region was so unstable, and therefore that premium is likely to hang around for quite a while. Nonetheless, the implication is that because you've got a higher price, you're getting an increase in supply, and this is one of the important changes. And Jim, you referred to this. It's the sort of the shale technology revolution has significantly increased the elasticity of the price elasticity of supply. So the higher prices we've seen over the last few months or so are now being locked in, particularly in the US, where of course you can hedge the prices, which means you're going to get an increase in supply. So assuming that the agreement is extended, Saudi Arabia is going to have to take on the swing role again. And this raises the question of how far do they realize the implications of this? And I say that because, of course, the old guard has pretty well gone over the last year or 2 years. The minister's gone, the people that sort of experienced this firsthand have gone. And so the question is, will they be willing to take this role on, and do they realize the implications of the swing role? Because the problem is, you get to a state where the term is misleading. Swing implies you're going up and down, but in fact, each time you cut a barrel of production, somebody else comes along and increases by 1 barrel their production. So it doesn't swing, it just goes down and down and down. And this is going to present them with a serious problem. This all links into the whole oil policy issue, and this is a complication for Saudi Arabia for the following reasons. We're in the process now of having a global energy transition. An energy transition is when an economy switches from one main source of energy to another. The energy transition we're going through at the moment is a transition away from hydrocarbon molecules into electrons. And this is going to have enormous implications for the future of demand for oil. And you're looking at a situation in Saudi Arabia, and indeed the other OPEC countries, where you potentially are going to have a lot of stranded assets. Now, what that does is it makes the imperative of economic diversification even stronger. In other words, as your oil is not going to be sold because demand is going to disappear, then in those circumstances you have to diversify your economy away from oil. But that is going to present very serious problems and serious political problems. It goes back to the discussion in Gorbachev's Soviet Union in the early 1990s between perestroika, economic liberalization, and glasnost, political liberalization. And the question is, can you have economic liberalization without political reform? Gorbachev said no. The Chinese said, yes, we can. Thank you for the economic liberalization, but we don't want the political liberalization. In Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, you are going to have both, because the property rights are so weighted against the private sector in these countries that without political reform, you're not going to get much of an impact. And at that point, I'll stop.
And Christian.
Thank you very much. I will focus on the recent changes in Saudi Arabia and some of the perspectives that are given in the media, one of which was this was a power grab. But I would argue that this power grab, to the extent it occurred, took place between January 2015 and June 2017, when Mohammed bin Salman formally became the Crown Prince. So a lot of the media discussion about a power grab was a bit of a misnomer. That has already concluded. Another issue that has been commonly raised over the past 10 days is that this new Saudi Arabia has shed a lot of the checks and balances of the Saudi Arabia we all thought we knew. And yes, that's probably true. The arrest of, or the detention and removal from position of Prince Muttab bin Abdullah as head of the National Guard did remove one of the last remaining power bases that the Crown Prince did not have control over. But again, there's no formal separation of power in Saudi Arabia as we have constitutionally here or in other states. The checks and balances in Saudi Arabia really grew up more by accident than by design. In the 1950s and 60s, when the first Saudi state, or the Saudi state that took shape, did so, you had key areas falling under control of powerful princes who were then impossible to dislodge. Think of the Minister of Defense in position for 48 years, the Minister of Interior, 37 years, the Foreign Minister, 40 years, King Abdullah as head of the National Guard for 48 years. All of those figures have passed away. Crown Prince Sultan in 2011, Crown Prince Nayef in 2012, the Foreign Minister in 2015, and King Abdullah. So the pathway to power, to the concentration of authority in one man, was really smoothed by these developments over the past 6 years, and was not necessarily a deliberate decision to try and dismantle those checks and balances. So we're having Saudi Arabia, the institutional structures are once again in play, they're once again fluid. We're almost going back to that situation of the 1950s when everything was sort of up for grabs, effectively, in terms of reshaping some of the institutional architecture. And this is, I think, what the Crown Prince is trying to do. He's 32 years old, and he's putting in place the structures and individuals of the kingdom that he intends to rule. Now, he intends to rule it for the next 40 or 50 years. So we're seeing a fundamental shift away from the Saudi Arabia that has been ruled since 1953 by the sons of the founding king, and this remaking of the power structures, this kind of recreation of those networks, the promotion by Mohammed bin Salman of a new generation of the grandsons and the great-grandsons of the founding king. So we are seeing, as what Jim said, this fundamental generational transition. As Paul has indicated, it's an open question whether the policymakers now coming to prominence have the experience of their predecessors who did, after all, live through all of the upheaval, the regional upheaval of the 1950s to the 1970s, and learned firsthand the pitfalls of what happens when you go too far in one direction and then have to pull back. We now have the Saudis arguably overextended, both militarily in Yemen and in terms of the diplomatic isolation of Qatar, not being able to figure out how to get forward and sort of any resolution of that dispute as well. And so I think more widely we're seeing a reconfiguration of power across the entire Persian Gulf, with an axis running from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi, the two crown princes of Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, really reshaping power relations and having implications not just for how the US engages with the region, made more difficult, I think, by the fact that the US doesn't necessarily have a settled policy right now either, but also in terms of the credibility of the Gulf partners as reliable security and military partners, which has been shaken over the past 5 months. We should not forget that in May, President Trump went to Riyadh to try and rally the Sunni Arab world against Iran, and within 2 days, the Sunni Arab world turned against each other. And so these are having lasting legacies of discord within a region that was, until very recently, solidly pro-Western in its outlook. It still is, but there are cracks opening up now, and powers such as Russia, Turkey, and Iran, which are trying opportunistically to fill some of those cracks. And so with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. I guess my first question is to ask each of you to talk a little bit, even among yourselves, about how interconnected are these issues. You know, we have these seemingly unconnected things of the rise of ISIS and extremism and the problems in Syria. We have the collapse of the oil price, largely because of overproduction, much of it coming from this country. And then we have the relationship with Iran. Are these things interconnected? How are these crises interconnected to one another? Are they, or are they completely separate? Or is one building upon another? Paul, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll kick off with that. I mean, I've always regarded the Middle East as an interconnected region. It's a bit like a balloon. You poke it in one place and it has a knock-on effect somewhere else. And so there is a great deal of interconnection from a political point of view. There's also very strong interconnections between what's happening politically and what's happened to the economy and vice versa. And a good example of this was the reason the oil price collapsed in 2014, and it came about because of something that I called in 2011 the OPEC's dilemma, that because of the Arab uprisings, the producer governments needed higher oil prices because they needed the revenues to keep the kids out of the streets and off the squares. Now, they got those higher prices. The problem is markets work, and the higher prices led to a sort of not necessarily a reduction in demand, but certainly muting demand, but certainly led to a dramatic increase in supply. So you had an oversupply in the market, which then led to the collapse in oil prices that we saw in the summer of 2014. And in that context, basically Saudi Arabia decided to give up the swing role because it was too costly for them, because it wasn't swinging. Every time they cut, somebody else would increase their barrel. And so they launched the price onto a competitive market, internationally competitive market. That's the first time that had happened since 1928, and I mean 1928, when the big oil companies got together at a Scottish castle called Achnacarry, and between them stitched up the international oil market. And that agreement, it was taken over by OPEC in the 70s. So the whole business of economy and politics are intertwined, which is one of the reasons it makes it so difficult to define what's going on.
I might add, there's a direct link here as well, between governance through patronage. When oil prices are high, there's patronage to spread around, and the legitimacy of the ruling families in the region is usually more secure because they can spread social welfare benefits, they can create jobs, they can give salary bonuses, et cetera. When the economy is not so robust, and typically when oil prices fall, they can't do the same thing. They have to find other methods to generate their legitimacy and retain public support. One of the ways they do that is through repression. So you'll typically see repression cranked up. Sometimes, openings that you saw for dialogue, freedom of speech, you'll see those shrink. Interestingly, in Saudi Arabia, we're seeing kind of a mixed bag here. You're seeing some increase in social freedoms, right? So announcements about women being allowed to drive, some reining in of the Mutawa, the religious police. At the same time, you're seeing a decrease in the space for dialogue, around the region, I would argue, and not just in Saudi Arabia. A lot of those countries have really cracked down on speech. I'd say there's a pretty direct link in that.
Yes, just building on what Jim was saying, the dilemma for some of the governments is that government spending tracked oil prices when they went up. But oil prices go down as well as up, and it's much harder in a distributive state where you don't necessarily have a democratic method of governance to link state and society to actually reduce spending to match the reduction of revenue, which has led to those budget deficits. So prices go down, but spending has been much more difficult to try to bring down. It's involved a lot of political trade-offs, which I think will go to the heart of the fact that you must have some element of political reform. Now, the irony is that a lot of the visions, like Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, are produced by Western consultants who often project a tabula rasa, kind of blank slate, that doesn't actually exist in reality. You have vested economic and political interests, even if they're subsurface, and they've often acted as a brake on some of the policy effectiveness that has slowed a lot of those changes. And so that, I think, is going to complicate Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia and other related matters, and perhaps create more of an environment of uncertainty. The political risk of doing business, as we've seen over the past 2 weeks, is, I think, much higher now than it was in the past. Even in a place like Dubai, the long-cherished myth that you can do business, economic and commercial business without political interference is now constrained by the fact that the blockade of Qatar is interfering with that. And so these are some difficult decisions that will continue, I think, to resonate for the foreseeable future.
Now, obviously, we're very concerned about Iran. And it seems to me, and many people in the media have said this, and I've said it, that since the rise of Prince Mohammed bin Salman to first a deputy crown prince, then crown prince, we have seen Saudi Arabia take a much harder line against Iran. And they've certainly taken a much harder line against friends of Iran. And in the last few weeks, we've seen what I suspect is an interesting either escalation by Iran or an escalation in rhetoric against Iran, with the Houthis sending the missile near Riyadh, the bombing of a pipeline in Bahrain, the Lebanese prime minister going to Riyadh and resigning because he thinks Iran has too much influence. We've seen tension between Saudi Arabia and Iraq over Iran. My first question is, are we giving MBS way too much credit? And what's really happening between Saudi Arabia and Iran? And I left out Qatar. I left out the standoff with Qatar as well, which was done over supposed friendship between Qatar and Iran. Can you comment about what's causing this escalation and how real it is, and who's to blame?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I can start with a few thoughts. I mean, I think potentially one of the things that's spurring this on is, I think the Saudis and their, the Emiratis see a window of opportunity with President Trump. They've got his ear, and they want to make a few changes in the order of things in the region. They were pretty upset by President Obama's moves towards reopening relations with Iran. They were upset by Obama removing one of our carrier battle groups from the Gulf. They didn't like his attitude towards the Arab Spring, towards their great ally Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, particularly. I think Obama used some language that suggested that Saudi Arabia and Iran were both sharing blame for the competition between them. That they were both and they both needed to stand down. And he was talking about a pivot towards Asia, a pivot away from this these continual entanglements in the Middle East. So I think that put some impetus into Saudi actions. The idea that Iran might return to the fold, that we might return to the old twin pillar strategy, where we had two allies in the Gulf, Iran under the Shah and Saudi Arabia, with Saudi Arabia being the junior partner in that relationship. The notion that the U.S. really does have some strategic commonalities with Iran. I mean, we're both, just for starters, on the same side in Iraq and in Afghanistan. I think there was probably some worries that, Iran might resurge to its old role as kind of the regional hegemon. How legitimate these worries are is anyone's guess. I mean, they're certainly genuinely felt over there. So I think with President Trump being more receptive, I think, to some of the Saudi and Emirati arguments. I think they've seen a window of opportunity that they need to move now if they don't want this this sort of pro-Iran trend to keep unfolding and eventually hamstringing them.
What I think is a lot of blowback from the previous administration's legacy. If you remember, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran and the P5+1 was signed in July 2015, but the initial deadline for the agreement was initially 31st of March. The war in Yemen began 5 days before that. Now, the Gulf states, led by the Saudis and Emiratis, were always concerned that a grand bargain could be struck between the US and Iran and that they would be cut out of the picture. And indeed, there were 2 years almost of secret negotiations facilitated by Oman, which preceded the formal open stage of the negotiation process. And the Gulf states felt cut out. It was P5+1, not P5+1 plus the Gulf in those negotiations. There was a fundamental difference of opinion. The Gulf states looked at Iran and saw a regional actor meddling and intervening in every conflict around them. Syria, in their view, Yemen, Bahrain, Iraq, encircled. They felt this was not an issue of nuclear diplomacy that you could isolate from everything else, as the Obama administration was doing. And so I would wonder if it is just a coincidence that the war in Yemen began just as those negotiations were reaching their climax, or was this a message from the Gulf states to Washington that if we don't feel we have your back to take action against what we see as the Iranian threat every single day, we'll do it ourselves. Now, one could argue that that's what happened, and this is now why we are where we are. They are bogged down. They cannot escalate to the point where they could try and have a decisive victory, because that would involve sending so many tens or hundreds of thousands of ground troops that the casualty levels would be politically fatalistic for anyone who tried to send them in. But the timing, for me, was all about this completely different approach to the Iranian issue and how they thought about it. And so we're seeing the legacy of that reverberate. And as Jim said, with President Trump, there was a sense that this could finally change. We could get the White House to swing behind a policy. The miscalculation over Qatar was that they assumed that once Trump switched sides, the rest of the US government would follow. And I think they miscalculated the pushback from the State Department and the Department of Defense, which was fully aware of the commercial and strategic value of the Qatari partnership to the US. So that was a miscalculation that followed on from the sense of opportunity that Jim mentioned, that Trump would not be, as Obama had been, someone they felt they could not trust.
Yeah, there's a number of elements to this. One that occurs to me is that the Al Saud detest the Shia, and I use the word detest deliberately. The only closest thing I can come to is the sort of Protestant Catholic in Northern Ireland. So it's a sort of fundamental dislike of that particular those particular individuals, which I think drives this to a certain extent. And I remember when I was little and going to school, I had a brother who was 2 years older than I was, and if there was somebody in the playground that I didn't like very much, but too big for me to take on, I would go over and insult them in the hope that they would hit me, and then if he hit me, my brother would come and sort him out. And I think there's an element of that at the moment to sort of persuade the US to sort of back up with Saudi and the others if there is going to be some sort of a military involvement.
Getting back to oil and the future of oil, certainly the OPEC allowed the Saudis, the OPEC led by Saudi Arabia, allowed the prices to drop in 2014. Part of that was to protect market share, to discourage higher cost producers coming on. But how much of it do you think is anticipation of lower electric vehicle prices, lower lithium ion prices, trying to make sure that they remain competitive in a world that is increasingly taking climate change seriously?
I don't think it was that well thought out in terms of that far ahead. Also as well, don't forget that when they launched the price onto the market in November 2014, I think they didn't realize just how far the price could actually fall. And they also, I think, underestimated the impact that the lower prices would have on US shale production. And I think the problem for that was there wasn't a real clear understanding of the difference between a break-even price and a shut-in price. So if you go back to 2014, all the trade press was saying, oh yeah, the price for US shale is $60 to $90 a barrel. Far too high, but that was what was believed. And they thought, well, if we bring the price down to 60, then that'll wipe out US shale. But that was the break-even price. That was the price that new investors look at. What matters was the price at which you would close in existing production, and that was somewhere south of $30 a barrel. So when the price started to come down, it had to go down a lot further than they actually anticipated. And then eventually in 2016, when it clearly wasn't working very well, they gave up on it and tried to go back to a controlled market. And that's where a lot of the problems stem from.
Yeah, I might chime in on this one as well briefly. I mean, it seems like the Saudis are following a two-track oil strategy here, and one of them is where they're a shorter-term strategy where they have a concern about price, and they're trying to raise the oil price for a number of reasons, for fiscal reasons inside their country. I mean, as my colleagues here mentioned, that the Arab Spring really raised the amount of spending and the oil price they need to break even for their government budgets. Now that's been coming down, but it's in a lot of the GCC, the break-even price is still higher than today's oil price, even at roughly $60. The other track is a longer-term strategy, and I think that's the more natural strategy for Saudi Arabia, is to focus on the long term. It's got such a massive reserve of crude oil. So they've got 50, 60, 70 years of crude oil left at current levels of production. So if you're somebody that's on that much oil, you do need to think longer term. And I think their natural advantage is going to be being a large supplier to the oil market, maintaining roughly their 13% share of the oil market that they've held since the 90s, or maybe even increasing that, given the climate risk to fossil fuels. I think oil is the only transportation fuel we've got that's viable right now. It still has a monopoly on transportation, but it's being chipped away at through various things, from biofuels, electric vehicles, or potentially fuel cells and whatnot. But if you're someone that thinks in those multi-decade type of period, you probably want to start thinking about what's going to be coming down the road, and how you need to reorient this sluggish economy, sluggish political system, to try and position yourself for a future that where oil is less important.
Can I start an argument?
Go ahead.
I do disagree with you about the idea that electric vehicles will chip away at the oil market. I think they will have huge inroads into it. And the reason I say this is because I know that for many years Saudi Aramco has been following electric vehicles options very closely indeed. And if you look at much of the conventional energy establishment, they're grossly underestimating the penetration of electric vehicles, which I think is going to be pretty spectacular. And I suspect the Saudis have a sense of this, which again reinforces this idea of an energy transition away from hydrocarbon molecules.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, again, I think it's one of these things that depends on government policies in countries. I mean, you're seeing some movement towards banning or phasing out internal combustion engines, including in China, which could be a real game changer. But I guess by chipping away at, I meant maybe more than a decade. I think your typical vehicle is in service for, 15 years, I think. So it's, I think it's still, you've got this massive legacy fleet that even if you did have a high uptake, it still takes a while to get to move that out.
Christian, let me ask you about engaging these younger, more aggressive leaders, and particularly, should we be careful with how we engage them since they are younger, more volatile, and are they secure in their positions?
Well, I think the issue is one that we have lost a lot of these certainties that we thought we at least knew, and that across the region there is this new cadre of leaders who are willing to shed some of the caution and some of the consensus, both within countries and across the region. The Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, was set up in 1981. It's been a fixture of regional politics for 36 years, built upon the sense that there's at least a shared interest on certain key issues. That's now been shattered. I mean, it exists on paper still, but the dispute over Qatar has really made it impossible to think that it can ever recohere. The kind of lasting damage has been done. And so you do have this generation of leaders who are willing to now put the national interest ahead of what in the past may have been a wider regional approach. The leaders of Kuwait and Oman are the only two of that old guard, apart from the King of Saudi Arabia, who are still alive. And there you do see a lot of pushback from Kuwait and Oman, trying to recover that sense of shared regional priority. And once they have also left the scene, there will be, I think, a much more bilateral sort of rod running from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi that will reshape Gulf politics, and you'll see other countries almost realigning against some of that reshaping. And so policy will become more volatile, perhaps more unpredictable. Of course, one could argue that the scale of economic challenges means that that's what's necessary, that you now do need those big grand schemes given the scale of some of the economic challenges. This is the time for a Vision 2030. The key, of course, will be implementation. Can they get from point A to point B? And if you look at some of the earlier visions that have now been going on for 20 years, they are nowhere near the targets that they set themselves at the beginning, because policy has always been made more difficult by the fact that it involves those political trade-offs that the kind of blank slate doesn't necessarily identify from 30,000 feet.
I'm always amazed at how quickly 40 minutes goes when you have three great speakers. I'd like to have you guys start thinking about questions from the audience. And while we get the microphones and everyone gets ready, I'm going to ask about what does this mean for OPEC? I think we expect them all to extend their quotas on November 29th. But with this level of disunity, and you throw in the problems with Venezuela, Nigeria, and Libya, can OPEC hold it together and remain a powerful cartel going forward?
At the risk of starting an argument, I think OPEC is virtually irrelevant and has been for quite a long time. Saudi Arabia is not, and relations between, say, Iran and Saudi Arabia are not. But OPEC as an institution, as an organization, has not been particularly effective for a great many years. There are divisions, but at the moment, the majority of OPEC countries, in fact, are producing fairly close to their capacity. So in that sense, there's less concern about problems of excess supply into the market. They will meet on the 29th, and there will be a lot of talk and discussion. And I suspect that from what we've heard coming out of Riyadh and indeed out of Moscow, that they will extend it. But that is not going to really matter very much, because the key will be if Saudi Arabia is willing to maintain or to carry on with the swing role. If it is not, then the oil market is in for a shock, because if everybody produces as much as they can, given the expectation of US production next year, the market is going to continue to be grossly oversupplied. You only have to look at the level of crude and petroleum stocks in the US, which are at record levels, to see that the market is going to be vulnerable, which means that the price could well start to, well, it's already starting to drift back again, although geopolitical premia will come back in and maybe boost it for a bit. But as I say, OPEC as an institution is now relatively irrelevant.
Okay, who has a question? Over here, in the pink shirt, I think.
In the pink shirt is right. I too am fascinated by Saudi Arabia, but we haven't heard a lot about the area east of the Gulf. And so I'd like to hear some comments, whether they're political or economic or oil, about Iran and Iraq. In Iran, we've also got an old man running things. So some comments about the impact of Iran and Iraq, please.
Who wants to? Me. How about you?
Go for it, Christian. I'm going to pick Christian.
Well, we are seeing some interesting realignments in Iraq, where you are seeing Muqtada al-Sadr now becoming a key ally of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis having finally, I think, figured out that the best way to try and return Iraq to its sort of pre-2003 fold is actually to try and detach key elements of the Iranian axis there. So you're seeing an interesting realignment, offset, of course, by the fact that the Iranian influence now with the fall of ISIS, that kind of strategic corridor that everybody talks about from Iran all the way to the Mediterranean, running through northern Iraq and northern Syria, is now more or less a geopolitical fact. In terms of the Iran deal, we mustn't forget that Iran also has critics of the deal. There are hardliners and moderates in Iran, just as there are in US politics. And so it's a intricate sort of dance on both in Iranian politics and in US politics as to the extent to which moderates or hardliners will come out on top. I think the Iranians feel that the financial sanctions are inhibiting, obviously, a lot of the alleviation that they hoped for once the specific sanctions came off in 2015. And that's a sense of disillusionment. On the other hand, of course, Rouhani won with an increased majority, and that was an indication that at least at the top level, there's still an element of support for the nuclear deal. I think the big issue going forward in Iran is who will become, or who will be jockeying for position to become the new supreme leader if and when Ali Khamenei passes away. And so that could be the next big sort of struggle within Iranian power politics. And by that time, of course, Iran will be firmly a post-revolutionary state. It will be 40 plus years since the revolution. That generation has almost had its time and gone. And so then how do you also then accommodate many of those political impulses for reform, which were just as strong as in Iran as they are in other parts of the Middle East?
Just to add one thing, just a brief comment. There's a great deal of disillusion in Iran as a result of the nuclear deal, because the financial sanctions were not part of the discussions in the nuclear negotiations. So when the nuclear negotiations finished and sanctions came off, the Iranians were all expecting that they were going to live happily ever after. The problem was the financial sanctions are seriously inhibiting the economic development in Iran, and this is causing increasing resentment. And there's an interesting question: will they jump before they're pushed?
Back here? Yes, sir.
Question here. Thank you. So I have a comment and a question pertaining also to Iran. Something to be cognizant of course. You comment all the way towards the end. I'm here, sorry.
Okay.
That in 2003, before 2003, of course, you didn't really have a boogeyman called Iran. So our role, of course, in the Middle East, especially going into Iraq and dismantling the state, is, I would describe maybe as kind of an original sin that we need to be cognizant of. Something that has not been really addressed. The question that I have about Iran is about the new Silk Route and China. China, of course, has in the past few years investing everywhere heavily, Africa, Asia. And in the case of Iran, for example, just a few months ago, they gave them a $10 billion line of credit. And if you look just at that map, going from China down to Pakistan, which they also are looking to invest in, and Iran, which they have already made a deal with, going to maybe Egypt, maybe Turkey. What are your thoughts really on the New Silk Route and that, Iran is kind of just moving on?
I think there's closer sources of energy, of natural gas, especially to China than Iran. That'll probably get tapped first. I mean, Russia, Turkmenistan. But Iran obviously has got giant natural gas reserves. There are some great potential markets for it right around Iran, but I would say maybe in Pakistan and in India, Iran's got a pipeline that's built to pretty close to the border of Pakistan. I think a lot of the reason that it doesn't cross the border is because of political opposition from the United States. So Pakistan has built an LNG import terminal at its Gwadar port. But they've also invested, they're also building coal-fired power plants. And it's a country that's normally, focused on natural gas. So I think it's a foreign policy mistake on behalf of the U.S. to block Iran from exporting natural gas to Pakistan and hopefully to India as well. Both, we don't want Pakistan to turn to coal, and we'd like to get India to prevent India from building even more coal-fired power plants. I mean, for their public health reasons and for climate reasons. So. Would love to see Iran get more integrated into these big population centers, demand centers right next door. But to China, I think it's a little further away, maybe a bit more of a stretch.
Okay, here, in white shirt.
View it from the standpoint of the oil industry. Consider the effect of electric cars, the fact that there are other sources of energy coming out of the mineral called white gold. Many times the energy that oil does. Also, what effect will the decrease in the use of gasoline have on the economics of this country, because there'll be a great reduction in income from oil.
So for those who did not hear, the question was about the impact of electric vehicles on the future of oil supply, as well as what the economics of less gasoline could have on the United States.
I confess I'm a great fan of electric vehicles. I think they have a great future because for me they tick all the right boxes. They tick the security of supply box. Close the Straits of Hormuz, who cares? They tick the climate change box, depending on how you generate the electricity, but given what's happened to the cost of renewables, this again is extremely attractive. They tick the box on urban air pollution, which has become now an increasing issue, not just in Beijing and New Delhi, but also in London, Paris, and a lot of other cities as well. And finally, they tick the box. One of the big problems with renewables is intermittency. With intermittency, you need storage. If you have a large car park of electric vehicles, there is your storage. And people are now seriously talking about building roads, for example, with induction strips in. So you drive along the road and charge the car in the same way you charge your electric toothbrush, or indeed discharge it into the grid and get paid. So I think they have a huge future. It clearly is going to have a very significant impact in the United States because of the dominance of gasoline in the barrel mix. and the taxes and all of those sorts of things. How that will work out will depend very much on how government responds to the situation, and I'm quite sure that governments, if they can't tax gasoline, will find something else to tax. I mean, this is what governments are very good at.
Well, I do have to say, as the owner of an electric vehicle that I bought a couple of months ago, I could not be happier with it, and I could not be happier never stopping at a gasoline station again. We're going to make this our last question right up here in front.
I follow the social media, and I see some resentment on the aggressiveness of Prince bin Salman. For example, holding the Prime Minister of Lebanon hostage, warning of the spread of disease, reports about killing Prince Abdulaziz bin Fahd, etc. How aggressive bin Salman can be going forward without putting his reform project at risk by provoking the average person?
For those who didn't hear, the question was about how far can Prince Mohammed bin Salman go with his aggressive remake of Saudi Arabia before he goes too far. And I would add on to that question, and what is the Trump administration to do about it?
Besides encourage it? Yeah, I don't know. You want to take that one?
Well, I mean, firstly, we don't know how much opposition there is because there's no real opinion polling. And, Twitter and social media are an echo chamber, but how much of that is just kind of venting and letting off steam online? So it's hard to tell. I mean, I think you're right in the sense that there is a concern that Mohammed bin Salman is overextending, and that especially once his father is no longer alive, there could be any number of groups within Saudi Arabia who have felt cut out of the new kingdom he's making, who could try and move against him, which may explain why he has tried to move against them first. But as I said, I mean, the big unknown is the extent to which there's a popular level of support for that move. My one concern, I think, is, I mean, again, we talked about this morning, is often said he's popular among young people. Well, we don't know. I mean, I think he's popular among young Saudis who've studied in the West, who have gone home, and who finally see someone who looks like them, who sounds like them, after seeing generations in which their leaders were 80 or 90 years old. We don't know how other Saudis who are living in areas where there's little change feel about it. But my concern is this: he's hitched his kind of wagon to the Vision 2030, to making Saudi Arabia a more attractive place to live, work, grow up for Saudis. But what if in 5 years nothing's changed? What if in 5 years it's still 30% unemployment for young Saudis? They feel they cannot afford to get married. They are cut out of some of the structures of wealth distribution that their parents took for granted. What if they think the system then is incapable of reforming itself? If he, Mohammed bin Salman, the one who promised everything, cannot deliver, what happens then when expectation turns to disillusionment? And I guess the other point there is, for the last few decades, as these problems began to emerge of diversification, of demographic change, that was always something you could project 20 years ahead. The oil price fall and the revenue collapse has made that more urgent. And because of his age, Mohammed bin Salman will be the one on whose watch this change has to happen. He's not King Abdullah. He's not going to be dead before the change happens, or even King Salman. It's on his watch, and whether he manages it or whether it gets away with him will probably decide, his long-term future. And so he's got to be the one who owns it in a way that King Salman, King Abdullah, King Fahd never had to own it, because the full extent would unfold after they were gone. But we cannot say the same about him. If he gets it right, he gets it right. But if he gets it wrong, then all bets are off.
Any recommendations for the Secretary? Tillerson?
Well, I think the U.S. government needs to have one voice on this. I think Secretary Tillerson is unrivaled in his expertise and experience of working with and in the region, but he's often made statements which have been undercut by tweets. We have the presidential daily brief in intelligence, but now we have the presidential daily tweet. And that's not helping.
Paul, I'm sorry, I've got to wrap it up.
Very quickly, I mean, one of the problems with MBS is he has raised expectations enormously. And it's amazingly how quickly people can become cynical. And already in Riyadh, people are referring not to Vision 2030, they're referring to Mirage 2030. And if the expectations are not met, that is when he's going to be in serious trouble.
Jim, any final comments?
I was optimistic when he came in. I mean, I thought that, the sclerotic policy making of these, geriatric rulers for the past, 3 decades had really allowed a lot of domestic problems to build up that he was going to bulldoze through and really, roll up his sleeves and start attacking some of these problems. He has done some of that, especially with their domestic demand for energy. But unfortunately, he seems to have gotten sidetracked on these foreign policy, with seemingly foreign policy dead ends. So I'm kind of sort of a mixed reaction. I mean, I think some of his initiatives are exactly what the kingdom needs, and some tough medicine that he's picked an opportune time to pursue. On the other hand, some of this foreign policy stuff is going to damage the effectiveness of his necessary domestic policy.
And I would just add that in my experience, I've seen many a dashing, young, charismatic revolutionary turn into a fat, balding, despotic dictator. One does not necessarily preclude the other. And with that, I thank you all for joining. And please, a round of applause for our panel.